friends, welcome back to our chapter reading. Today we are still continuing with The Trumpet of the Swan by E.B. White. When we left off last time, Louis was wanting to earn some money, and so Sam had gotten him a job as the person that blows the trumpet to play the different sounds for his camp. So we're going to pick up today in chapter 11, and chapter 11 is called Camp Kookooskoos. Camp Kookooskoos was on a small lake deep in the woods of Ontario. There were no summer cottages on the lake, no outboard motors, no roads with cars rushing by. It was a wilderness lake, just right for boys. Mr. Beaver left Sam and Louie at the end of a dirt road, and they finished their journey to camp by canoe. Sam sat in the stern and paddled, and Louie stood in the bow and looked straight ahead. The camp consisted of a big log cabin where everybody ate, 7 tents where the boys and the counselors slept, a dock out front, and a privy out back. The woods closed in all around, but there was a bare spot that had been made into a tennis court, and there were plenty of canoes in which to take trips to other lakes. There were about 40 boys. When Sam's canoe grounded on the sandy beach next to the camp dock, Louis stepped ashore wearing his slate, his chalk pencil, and his trumpet. About 20 boys rushed down to the landing to see what was going on. They could hardly believe their eyes. "Hey, look what's here!" one of the boys yelled. "A bird!" cried another. "Look at the size of him!" Everybody crowded around Louis, wanting to get a close look at the new camper. Sam had to push some of the boys back to keep Louis from getting crushed. "Take it easy, will you?" Sam implored. That evening after supper, the director of the camp, Mr. Brickle, built a big campfire in front of the main lodge. The boys gathered around. They sang songs and toasted marshmallows and swatted mosquitoes. Sometimes you couldn't understand the words of a song because the boys sang with marshmallows in their mouths. Louis did not join the group. He stood by himself a little distance. After a while, Mr. Brickle rose to his feet and addressed the boys and the counselors. "I call your attention," he said, "to a new camper in our midst, Louis the Swan. He is a trumpeter swan, a rare bird. We are lucky to have him. I have employed him at the same salary I pay my junior counselors, $100 for the season. He is gentle and has a speech defect. He came here from Montana with Sam Beaver. Louis is a musician. Like most musicians, he is in need of money. He will wake you at daybreak with his trumpet. He will call you to meals, and at night, when you're dropping off to sleep, he will play taps, and that will bring the day to a close. I caution you to treat him as an equal and to treat him with respect. He packs a terrific wallop with one of those wings. I now introduce, for your listening pleasure, Louis the Swan. Take a bow, Louis." Louis was embarrassed, but he came forward and bowed. Then he raised his trumpet to his mouth and blew a long conk. When he finished, from the opposite side of the lake where there came an echo. Conk. The boys clapped. Louis bowed again. Sam Beaver, sitting with the others, his mouth full of marshmallows, was delighted that his plan had succeeded. At the end of the summer, Louis would have $100. A boy named Applegate Skinner stood up. "Mr. Brickle," he said, "what about me? I don't care for birds. I've never liked birds." "Okay, Applegate," said Mr. Brickle. "You don't have to like birds. If that's the way you feel about it, just go ahead not liking birds. Everyone is entitled to his likes and dislikes and to his prejudices. Come to think of it, I don't care for pistachio ice cream. I don't know why I don't like it, but I don't. Do not forget, however, that Louis is one of your counselors. Whether you like him or not, he must be treated with respect." One of the new boys, who had never been to camp before, stood up. "Mr. Brickle," he said, "why is the camp called Camp Kookooskoos? What does Kookooskoos mean?" "It's an Indian name for the great horned owl," replied Mr. Brickle. The new boy thought about this for a minute. "Then why didn't you just call it Camp Great Horned Owl instead of Camp Kookooskoos?" "Because," replied Mr. Brickle, "a boys' camp should have a peculiar name. Otherwise, it doesn't sound interesting. Kookooskoos is a terrific name. It's a long word, but it only has 3 letters in it. It has 2 S's, 3 K's, and 6 O's. You don't find many names as kooky as that. The queerer the name, the better the camp. Anyway, welcome to Camp Kookooskoos. It rhymes with moose. That's also another good thing about it. And now it's time for everybody to go to bed. You may take a swim before breakfast tomorrow, and you don't need to wear your swim trunks. Just jump out of bed when you hear the trumpet of the swan, strip off your pajamas, race to the dock, and dive in. I will be there ahead of you to do my celebrated backflip from the diving tower. It freshens me up for the hard day ahead. Good night, Louie. Good night, Sam. Good night, Applegate. Good night, all." The light was fading. The boys straggled off to their tents in the darkness. The senior counselors sat together on the porch and smoked one last pipe. Sam crawled in under his blankets in tent 3. Louie walked to a high, flat rock by the shore and stood there waiting. When the lights were all out, he faced the camp, raised his horn to his mouth, and blew taps. Day is done, gone the sun, from the lake, from the hills, from the sky. All is well, safely rest, God is nigh. The last note seemed to linger on the still waters of the lake. From their beds, the boys heard the beautiful sound. They felt sleepy and serene and happy, all but Applegate Skinner, who didn't care for birds at bedtime. But even Applegate was soon asleep, along with the others in his tent. He was asleep and he was snoring. People who dislike birds often snore. A deep peace fell over Camp Kookooskoos. And here's a picture of Louie playing taps on the trumpet at night. He's got a good spot there on that rock to play so that all the sound can go through the woods for the boys to hear. Chapter 12, A Rescue. Louie liked to sleep on the lake. At night, after blowing taps, he would waddle down to the sandy beach by the dock. There, he removed his slate, his chalk pencil, and his trumpet, and hid them under a bush. Then he shoved off into the water. As soon as he was afloat, he would tuck his head under a wing. For a while, he would doze and think about home and his parents. Then he would think about Serena, how beautiful she was and how much he loved her. Pretty soon, he would be fast asleep. When daylight came, he would swim ashore and eat a light breakfast of water plants. Then he would put his things on, climb onto the flat rock, and blow reveille. The boys, hearing the trumpet, would wake and rush to the dock to swim before breakfast. After supper at night, the campers would often play volleyball. Louie loved the game. He couldn't hop around as fast as the boys, but he could reach out with his long neck and poke the ball into the air and over the net. It was very hard to get a ball past Louie. He could return almost any shot. When the boys chose sides at the start of a game, Louie was always the first to be chosen. The boys loved camp life in Ontario. They learned how to handle a canoe. They learned to swim. Sam Beaver took them on nature walks and taught them to sit quietly on the log and observe wild creatures and birds. He showed them how to walk in the woods without making a lot of noise. Sam showed them where the kingfisher had his nest, in a hole in the bank by the stream. He showed them the partridge and her chicks. When the boys heard a soft coo-coo, coo-coo-coo, Sam told them they were listening to the saw-whet owl, smallest of the owls, no bigger than a man's hand. Sometimes in the middle of the night, the whole camp would wake to the scream of a wildcat. Nobody ever saw a wildcat during the entire summer, but his scream was heard at night. One morning, when Sam was playing tennis with Applegate Skinner, Sam heard a clanking noise. He looked behind him, and there, coming out of the woods, was a skunk. The skunk's head was stuck in a tin can. He couldn't see where he was going. He kept bumping into trees and rocks, and the can went clank, clank, clank. "That skunk is in trouble," said Sam, laying down his racket. "He's been to the dump looking for food. He poked his head into that empty can, and now he can't get it out." The word spread quickly, though, through the camp that a skunk had arrived. The boys came running to see the fun. Mr. Brickle warned them not to get too close. The skunk might squirt them with perfume. So the boys danced around, keeping their distance and holding their noses. The big question was how to get the can off the skunk's head without getting squirted. "He's going to need help," said Sam. "That skunk will starve to death if we don't get that can off." All the boys had suggestions. One boy said they should make a bow and arrow, tie a string to the arrow, and shoot the arrow at the can. Then, when they hit the can, they could pull the string and the can would come off the skunk's head. Nobody thought much of that suggestion. It sounded like too much work. Another boy suggested that 2 boys climb a tree, and one boy could hang by his feet from the other boy's hands. And when the skunk walked under the tree, the boy who was hanging by his feet could reach down and pull off the can. And if the skunk squirted, The perfume wouldn't hit the boy because he would be hanging in the air. Nobody thought much of that suggestion. Mr. Brickle didn't like it at all. He said it was extremely impractical, and furthermore, he would not permit it. Another boy suggested that they get a block of wood, smear it with glue, and when the skunk knocked against it, the can would stick to the block of wood. Nobody thought much of that suggestion. Mr. Brickle said he didn't have any glue anyway. While everybody was making suggestions, Sam Beaver walked quietly to his tent. He returned in a few minutes with a long pole and a piece of fish line. Sam tied one end of the fish line to the pole. Then he tied a slip knot in the other end of the line and formed a noose. Then he climbed to the roof of the porch and asked the other boys not to get too close to the skunk. The skunk in all this time was blundering around, blindly bumping into things. It was a pitiful sight. Sam, holding his pole, waited patiently on the roof. He looked like a fisherman waiting for a bite. When the skunk wandered close to the building, Sam reached over, dangled the noose in front of the skunk, slipped the noose around the can and gave it a jerk. The noose tightened and the can came off. As it did so, the skunk turned around and squirted right at Mr. Brickle, who jumped back, stumbled, and fell. All the boys danced around, holding their noses. The skunk ran off into the woods. Mr. Brickle got up and dusted himself off. The air smelled strong of skunk. Mr. Brickle smelled too. "Congratulations, Sam," said Mr. Brickle. "You have aided a wild creature and have given Camp Kookooskoos a delicious dash of wild perfume. I'm sure we'll all remember this maladroitous event for a long time to come. I don't see how we can very well forget it." "Honk!" cried Louis, lifting his trumpet. The lake echoed with the sound. The air was heavy with the rich, musky smell of skunk. The boys danced and danced, holding their noses. Some of them held their stomachs and pretended to throw up. Then Mr. Brickle announced it was time for the morning swim. "A swim will clear the air," he said, as he walked away toward his cottage to change his clothes. After lunch each day, the campers went to their tents for a rest period. Some of them read books. Some of them wrote letters home, telling their parents how bad the food was. Some just lay on their cots and talked. One afternoon during rest period, the boys in Applegate's tent began testing him about his name. "Applegate Skinner," said one boy. "Where'd you get such a crazy name, Applegate?" "My parents gave it to me," replied Applegate. "I know what his name is," said another boy. "Sour Applegate. Sour Applegate Skinner." The boys howled at this and began chanting, "Sour Applegate, Sour Applegate, Sour Applegate." "Quiet!" bellowed the tent leader. "I don't think it's funny," said Applegate. "His name isn't Sour Applegate," whispered a boy. "His name is Wormy Applegate. Wormy Applegate Skinner." This suggestion was greeted with screams of laughter. "Quiet!" bellowed the tent leader. "I want quiet in this tent. Leave Applegate alone." "Leave rotten Applegate alone," whispered another boy. And some of the other boys had to pull their pillows over their heads so their snickering couldn't be heard. Applegate was sore. When the rest period was over, he wandered down to the dock. He didn't like being made fun of, and he wanted to do something to get even. Without saying anything to anybody, he slid a canoe into the water and paddled out into the lake, heading for the opposite shore a mile away. No one noticed him. Applegate had no business taking a canoe out alone. He had not passed his swimming test. He had not passed his canoe test. He was disobeying a camp rule. When he was a quarter of a mile from the shore, in deep water, the wind grew stronger. The waves got higher. The canoe was hard to manage. Applegate got scared. Suddenly, a wave caught on the canoe and spun it around. Applegate leaned hard onto his paddle. His hand slipped and he lost his balance. The canoe tipped over. Applegate found himself in the water. His clothes felt terribly soggy and heavy. His shoes dragged him down and he could barely keep his head above water. Instead of hanging onto the canoe, he just started swimming toward the shore, which was a crazy thing to do. One wave hit him square in the face and he got a mouthful of water. "Help!" he screamed. "Help me, I'm drowning! I'll give the camp a bad name if I drown! Help! Help!" Counselors sprinted to the waterfront. They jumped into canoes and rowboats and started for the drowning boy. One counselor kicked his moccasins off, dove in, and began swimming toward Applegate. Mr. Brickle raced to the dock, climbed to the diving tower, and directed the rescue operation, shouting through a megaphone. "Hold on to the canoe, Applegate," he shouted. "Don't leave the canoe!" But Applegate had already left the canoe. He was all alone, thrashing about and wasting his strength. He felt sure that he would soon go to the bottom and drown. He felt weak and scared. Water had gotten into his lungs. He couldn't last much longer. The first boat to get away from the dock was rowed by Sam Beaver, and Sam was pulling hard at the oars, straining every muscle, but things didn't look good for Applegate. The boats were still a long way away from the boy. When the first cry of help was heard in the camp, Louis was coming around the corner of the main lodge. He spied Applegate immediately and responded to the call. "I can't fly out there," thought Louis, "because my flight feathers have been falling out lately. But I can certainly make better time than those boats." Dropping his slate and his chalk pencil and his trumpet, Louis splashed into the water and struck out, beating his wings and kicking with his great webbed feet. A swan, even in summer when he can't fly, can scoot across the water at high speed. Louis's powerful wings beat the air. His feet churned the waves as though he were running on top of water. In a moment, he had passed all the boats. When he reached Applegate, he quickly dove, pointed his long neck between Applegate's legs, and then came to the surface with Applegate sitting on his back. Cheers came from the people on the shore and in the boats. Applegate clung to Louis's neck. He had been saved in the nick of time. Another minute, and he would have been gone to the bottoms. Whatever would have filled his lungs, he would have been a goner. "Thank you, God!" shouted Mr. Brickle through his megaphone. "Great work, Louis. Camp Kookooskoos will never forget this day. The reputation of the camp has been saved. Our record for safety is still untarnished." Louis didn't pay much attention to all the shouting. He swam very carefully over to Sam's boat, and Sam pulled Applegate into the boat and helped him into the stern seat. So here's a picture of Applegate riding Louis the Swan. "You looked pretty funny riding a swan," Sam said, "and you're lucky to be alive. You're not supposed to go out alone in a canoe." But Applegate was too scared and wet to say anything. He just sat and stared straight ahead, spitting water out of his mouth and breathing hard. At supper that night, Mr. Brickle placed Louis at his right, in the place of honor. When the meal was over, he rose and made a speech. "We all saw what happened on the lake today. Applegate Skinner broke a camp rule, took a canoe out alone, and upset. He was drowning when Louis the Swan, rapidly outdistancing all other campers, reached his side, held him up, and saved his life. Let us all give Louis a standing ovation." That means they all stood up and clapped for Louis. The boys and the counselors stood up. They cheered and clapped and beat on tin plates with spoons. Then they sat down. Louis looked embarrassed. "And now, Applegate," said Mr. Brickle, "I hope the rescue has caused you to change your opinion of birds. The first day you were here in camp, you told us you didn't care for birds. How do you feel now?" "I feel sick to my stomach," replied Applegate. "It makes you sick to your stomach to almost drown. My stomach still has a lot of water in it." "Yes, but what about birds?" asked Mr. Brickle. Applegate thought hard for a moment. "Well," he said, "I'm grateful to Louis for saving my life, but I still don't like birds." "Really?" said Mr. Brickle. "That's quite remarkable. Even though a bird saved you from drowning, you don't care for birds? What have you got against birds?" "Nothing," replied Applegate. "I have nothing against them. I just don't care for them." "Okay," said Mr. Brickle. "I guess we'll just have to leave it at that. But the camp is proud of Louis. He is our most distinguished counselor, a great trumpet player, a great bird, a powerful swimmer, and a fine friend. He deserves a medal. In fact, I intend to write a letter recommending that he be given the life-saving medal." Mr. Brickle did as he promised. He wrote a letter. A few days later, a man arrived from Washington with the life-saving medal, and while all the campers watched, he hung the medal around Louis's neck, alongside the trumpet, the slate, and the chalk pencil. It was a beautiful medal. Engraved on it were the words, "To Louis the Swan, who, with outstanding courage and complete disregard for his own safety, saved the life of Applegate Skinner." Louis took off his slate and wrote, "Thank you for this medal. It is a great honor." But he thought to himself, "I'm beginning to get overloaded with stuff around my neck. I've got a trumpet, I've got a slate, I've got a chalk pencil, now I've got a medal. I'm beginning to look like a hippie. I hope I'll still be able to fly when my flight feathers grow in again." That night, when darkness came, Louis blew the most beautiful taps he had ever blown. The man who had brought the medal was listening and watching. He could hardly believe his ears and eyes. When he returned to the city, he told people what he had seen and heard. Louis's fame was growing. His name was known. People all over were beginning to talk about the swan that could play a trumpet. All right, friends, that's all for today. So I will see you back next time, and we will find out what happens next.